This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on the chaos in Afghanistan and its ramifications. The participants are Dilip Sinha, former ambassador, and Aditi Tandon, journalist.
The rapidly unfolding events in Afghanistan after the takeover of the Taliban are creating a lot of tension and apprehension across the world. There are questions about regional security as well as the international security with respect to the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban this Sunday. Today we saw that the Taliban entered at least two of India's consulates in Afghanistan and searched for documents and looked away for parked cars. The government sources also have indicated today and expressed worry that this only means that the Taliban is acting against the assurances which its leaders have been giving to the world. Mr. Sinha, the events are rapidly unfolding. Everything is extremely fluid. We are still watching government formation talks going on. How do you look at this evolving dynamic situation?
Well, it is, as you said, Aditi, extremely fluid. The Taliban, true to their form, are now starting to show their claws. The earlier agreement which they had signed with the US last year and the agreement that they had that they would not attack US bases and installations fell apart when there was that sudden movement and exit of the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, who left because of internal differences within his own government and the impending Taliban takeover. He fled for his life. This left the Afghan government in turmoil and the civil administration of Kabul collapsed. The Taliban then moved into Kabul city in the evening on last Sunday and took over the city. The people of Kabul who were apprehensive of the Taliban took flight and went to the airport. What the Americans had done was to withdraw all their troops to the airport and create a cordon sanitaire there where all their embassy staff and other personnel could be safe from the Taliban. The Taliban then created a further perimeter around the Kabul airport and tried to stop at least the Afghans going into the airport and then fleeing. So those who had been able to reach Kabul airport before the Taliban came in were there. Utter chaos there on Monday, and we saw many Afghan people getting killed in the chaos, some while trying to escape. So in this situation, there was utter chaos in Kabul because of the collapse of the civil administration, the flight of the Afghan president, and the complete absence or the melting away of the Afghan army. So it was a situation of each for himself. The Afghan people were trying to protect their interests by fleeing from Afghanistan. The embassy personnel and the Afghans who used to work for these embassies, they tried to get to the airport so that they could flee. And each country then decided that the first thing to do was to protect its own citizens and the Afghans who were working for them. So India was able to pull out its own embassy personnel and some of the Afghans who could come in the aircraft, and other countries did the same. So it was a case of the Hobbesian each for himself and the devil take the hindmost that was in play. And
I'd like to just interrupt your thought here and just add one supplementary, if you could also reflect on that. Now that we saw today and government sources did confirm that, there were raids by the Taliban at the Indian consulates in Kandahar and in Herat, and they did search certain closets. Apparently, they were looking at certain documents at the behest of the Pakistani administration, and the Indian sources have said that they were expecting this. However, it is quite ironical that days before the raids on the Indian consulates by the Taliban fighters, the Taliban had actually reached out to Delhi and had said that they did not want India to evacuate the diplomats from Kabul, and they actually wanted that the embassy should continue to function out of Kabul. So how do you look at Taliban too? Because everybody is debating whether this is a new Taliban. Will it actually moderate its old, harsh Islamic interpretation of the law and its very violent image? How do you look at the Taliban?
One thing is certain in this, that the Taliban, the image that they are trying to project to the world, that image has certainly changed. Or at least they are trying to change that image. They're trying to project the image of a conciliatory body that can act like a responsible government, which respects human rights, of course, human rights within quotes. But whether they have actually turned a new leaf is impossible for anybody to say. Nobody at the present moment entirely believes that the Taliban have changed. From Western countries to even countries in the region, everybody is following a wait and watch policy. This includes even Russia and China, who have been very close touch with the Taliban all through these last perhaps even years. But even they are following a wait and watch policy because they want to see whether the Taliban actually live up to the image that they are trying to create or trying to show to the world. Now, for India, things are even more difficult than they are for the other regional countries because we must remember that the Taliban is in close alliance with this organization called the Haqqani Network. The Haqqani Network is run by a person called Sirajuddin Haqqani, and the Haqqani Network is a banned organization under the UN sanctions, and everybody knows that the Haqqani Network works entirely under the control of the ISI of Pakistan. And Sirajuddin Haqqani is one of the deputies in the Taliban hierarchy. So, for us, there is the additional problem that the Taliban have elements both within the Taliban and the Haqqani network who are controlled by Pakistan and therefore are particularly hostile to India. So these raids that you mentioned that have taken place on the Indian consulate and will, I am sure, take place in the Indian embassy also are part of this network. You must remember there was a time when there were repeated attacks on the Indian embassy in Kabul even earlier because our embassy was always a target and we lost several of our people because of the targeting by the elements of the Taliban which are entirely controlled by the Pakistani ISI.
Right. In fact, yesterday, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, while addressing the United Nations Security Council, did flag the heightened activities of the proscribed Haqqani network and also said that Pakistan-based terror networks such as the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed continue to operate with impunity and encouragement, from Pakistan. And he did call upon the UNSC not to adopt a selective approach when condemning terrorism and to keep an eye out for whatever is happening in Afghanistan. I'd also like your comments on this new threat. In fact, the UNSC did discuss this report of the Secretary General with respect to the ISIL and the threats of ISIL, how it is expanding. And there's this new threat now, a self-proclaimed group of ISIL Khorasan, which is expanding its presence in Afghanistan. How do you look at that, considering the Haqqani network in the past has worked with Al-Qaeda and trained terrorists to come and perpetrate violence in Kashmir?
Such reports of the UN have been coming to the Security Council even earlier. There have been reports 6 months earlier, last year also, where the UN said that the Taliban continues to maintain links with the Al-Qaeda and also with ISIL. But such reporting is uncomfortable to the United States because it doesn't fit in the game plan that it has prepared at least since February last year when it signed that deal with the Taliban under which agreed to hand over power to the Taliban and withdraw its forces. That has become quite clear. The timeline set in the deal did not entirely get played out. It got delayed a bit. But this is the framework within which the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. And the US has withdrawn on the understanding that the Taliban will not allow organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIL to come back and recreate a base in Afghanistan. Now, the UN reports discount this assurance. And for India, what is even more difficult is that Taliban have made no commitment that they will not allow other terrorist organizations to come in, especially ones that will disturb regional peace. And for India, organizations like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, which currently operate from Pakistan, but may move their centers to Afghanistan. And from Pakistan's viewpoint, it will be useful to do that because then Pakistan can claim that it has a clean house and it should be removed from the international financial sanctions that it is facing under the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF.
There are certain experts who maintain that the Taliban of today, might not like to play an absolute proxy to the Pakistan like the Taliban of the 1996. We also know that Mullah Baradar, who's the public face of the Taliban and is at the head of the negotiation table in Doha, was actually arrested by the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence in 2010. So, there are issues on that front also. Do you believe that although Pakistan has leverage over the Taliban, it may not actually have absolute control over the Taliban? Do you believe in that?
Pakistan does not need to have absolute control over the Taliban for it to carry out its nefarious terrorist designs. even if it has an influential section of the Taliban willing to play ball, that's good enough for it. You're quite right in saying that Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar has not endeared himself to Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan has put him in jail, and it was the Americans who got him out of there and have made him the chief, the main face, the international face of the Taliban. But Pakistan will only need to have some sections of the Taliban willing to do its work, and the Haqqani network is quite adequate for this purpose. So for terrorism, you don't require the whole of Afghanistan. Some places and some factions of Taliban are enough for Pakistan to carry out its nefarious activity.
You know, the International Monetary Fund yesterday suspended US $440 million aid to Afghanistan, saying that there was no government there and that nobody could access the IMF resources without the presence of a formal government. Also, the United States has said, President Joe Biden has said that the US will use economic tools to exercise influence in Afghanistan. Do you see the economic part of the whole game as an important tool to perhaps check Afghanistan, the new Taliban fighters who are taking over Afghanistan? Would that help?
The economic stranglehold can certainly play an important part in this. If the West decides to impose economic sanctions in Afghanistan, it will drive Afghanistan straight into the hands of China, which can easily fund Afghanistan's financial requirements. So this game will start coming into play. The arguments for the West will be that if you don't help the Taliban government, then you lose whatever leverage you have in that country. And that is the kind of argument that the West uses for continuing to provide assistance to Pakistan. So this is high politics that comes into play, and a very cynical kind of politics. So right now the IMF has withheld funds. We have to wait and see once the Taliban government has been formed and the current chaos that is there in Kabul if it is settled, then what policy does the IMF follow? Will it continue to withhold funds, or will it then say that we have a government in Afghanistan and we should release funds?
Also, you know, the issue of the humanitarian crisis which continues to unfold in Afghanistan, and the fact that the Indian government has actually opened a new emergency visa route for those who wish to come to India, and have clearly said that minority Sikh and Hindus will actually be taken in, because that will remain challenging. Evacuation of the embassy staff has happened, plus some Indians has happened, but how many Indians are left behind? And India would continue to have to engage with the United States to ensure safe evacuation of its nationals from Afghanistan, isn't that?
Yes, I hope that India will be able to evacuate its own nationals very quickly, and I presume there will not be much difficulty in this, because there are reports that the Taliban are not holding back foreign nationals. Their effort essentially is to stop the Afghans from fleeing, and those Afghans who are trying to flee are the ones that are targeted by the Taliban. So that the Afghans are left in a very difficult situation. If they stay at home and try and hide, they become targets. If they try to flee, again they become targets of the Taliban. So in this deal that the US signed with the Taliban and the way the deal has unfolded, the worst victims have been the people of Afghanistan, especially the people of Kabul, who had looked forward to a new Afghanistan and had tried to build a new Afghanistan, which is clearly not in sync with the emirate that the Taliban will seek to build in the country.
Afghanistan has changed a lot in the last 20 years. 2/3 of the population of Afghanistan is actually below 30. Do you think that along with women who face a real risk from the Taliban?
Well, the resistance of the Taliban will have to come militarily, because the Taliban carry guns with them and they shoot. The kind of resistance that you can expect people like this, the citizens of Kabul, etc., the new generation, is the kind of resistance that civilians build up when you take out demonstrations and you protest, which happens in civilized countries. But those kinds of protests will be dealt with very, very harshly by the Taliban, and that will leave the poor people extremely vulnerable, and they have to protect their lives first before trying to protest in a civilian manner. So we have to wait and see if some of the sections of these people can join the resistance movement.
So it's clearly a very uncertain future, not only for Afghanis, but also for the neighbors, including India. So let's wait and watch what happens. Thank you for your time, Mr. Sinha.
Thank you, Aditi.
You were listening to a discussion on the chaos in Afghanistan and its ramifications. The participants were Dilip Sinha, former ambassador, and Aditi Tandon, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.